So let me just begin by saying, just delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to the Humanities Department, and especially to Michael Tomko, who organized the visit. So Michael and I started graduate school at Notre Dame at the same time in the year 2000, and we quickly realized that we just had a lot in common. So we both came from liberal arts backgrounds in college. We both had a great respect for the Catholic intellectual tradition, a love of literature and philosophy. We very quickly grew to love Notre Dame football together. I'm claiming Notre Dame today. By the way, not Fordham, because Villanova just destroyed Fordham football. And perhaps more importantly than anything, we both, I mean, to my mind at least, our relationship with Michael and Helena, so we both were lucky enough to marry these fabulous British women who are smart and talented and funny, just deeply impressive people. So that alone is enough for a friendship for a lifetime. I'm very pleased to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about the background for how I became interested in the topic. Tim, you did a good job of kind of setting the scene a bit, because one of the things I was struck by as I went into graduate school in philosophy, philosophy, the love of wisdom, was how little wisdom was in fact discussed when I got there. So how little professional philosophers actually still talked about wisdom. They talk about many other very important things. Justice is discussed, fairness, epistemic goods like knowledge, but wisdom was kind of left out of the picture. So I was puzzled, and I thought, at some point I really want to tackle the nature of wisdom. I want to think about it. Or really it was a cluster of things that I thought were neglected, what you might think of as higher epistemic goods, like understanding or wisdom, epistemic goods that we really prize that are much harder to attain, you might think, than just knowing that there are students in the room, just things you can grasp with your eyes. So I focused my attention for a long time on understanding, and it's the basis of this large project that I'm now happy to be running. And I put off wisdom for a number of years, and I think the reason was that I just thought the topic was too daunting, was too difficult. And I think really at the back of it was I thought that in order to write about wisdom, you in fact had to be wise. And I thought, so I'm not wise, let's wait maybe for another 30 or 40 years, maybe something will change and I'll be in a good position to write about it. But what happened maybe a year or two ago when I started to think more about it is I realized that that's not the case, that you don't in fact have to be wise to write about wisdom. And here's what I want you to think about in the talk when we're thinking about this topic, about the nature of wisdom. What I realize is that even though I don't consider myself wise, I do consider other people in my life wise. In fact, my wife, I think she's wise. I do consider other people wise. I think of, say, my grandfather as well. I think of certain people I think of certain professional philosophers that I know who are wise. I think of certain colleagues of mine who are wise. And I would wager, I'd be almost certain, that you all can think of people in your lives who are wise as well. So not only can I think of people who are wise, I think I can also think of people who are less than wise, maybe even some people who are foolish. And again, I reckon you all can think of people who are less than wise or maybe foolish too. So now here's the exercise you might say of tonight. What I'm wondering is what kind of characteristics are you picking out? So if you think of a friend, an aunt, an uncle, some professor in the room as wise, what properties do they have in virtue of which you think they're wise? What's behind the judgment of wisdom? Again, you don't have to be wise yourself to try to make sense of these different judgments you make. So one way to think about what I'm on about in the talk is, you might think of this as almost, it's a cartography of wisdom. You're trying to draw a map of wisdom. Our concept of wisdom, when we think about it, has certain contours, and what I'm interested in is what those contours are like. Okay, so that's the big picture. Now, I've been talking about wisdom, so turning your hand out a bit. But I'm really going to be thinking about, it's worth making at the beginning a distinction between different kinds of wisdom. So we talk, I think, pretty readily of things like someone could be a wise baseball manager, or someone could be a wise stock analyst, or someone could be a wise gardener, or a wise mechanic. But I think we could also speak not just in those what you might call domain-specific senses about wisdom, but we also speak more generally, not just about the wise mechanic, the wise stock analyst, but about the wise person. So it's no contradiction to say something like, well, someone might be a wise stock analyst, that you don't think they're really wise, or you don't think that they're wise overall, you might say. So it's this notion of being wise overall, really wise, wise in general. That's the specific notion of wisdom that I'm trying to get at. What does it take for a person to be wise in general, as opposed to wise in a particular area? And the general view that I'm going to defend is that, it sounds obvious, but this is good in philosophy, I think. So that the wise person is someone who knows how to live well. So even though that might sound obvious, might almost sound like a platitude, that the wise person is someone who knows how to live well, there's still always a difficulty in philosophy in fleshing out the general idea, in kind of laying out its particular parts, in answering objections, even though that seems like a platitude perhaps, that the wise person is someone who knows how to live well. Even that, as we're going to see, people have objected to it for various reasons. So, but that's the general scheme that general idea I'm going to defend, that the wise person is someone who knows how to live well. And now we're on section 3 already of the handout. My claim is going to be that that kind of knowledge of how to live well is in fact constituted by 3 different types of, you might say, sub-knowledge, or that general kind of knowledge of how to live well can be broken down into these specific types of knowledge. And the 3 types are, which I'll talk about in more detail, is I think the wise person is someone who knows what's good or important for well-being. I think that's one thing that the wise person knows. That the wise person knows where he or she stands relative to what's good or important for well-being. And that the wise person has knowledge of some effective strategy for bringing about what's good or important for well-being. So I think wisdom, in fact, so we can say informative things about what it means to know how to live well. Now, you might think, so I'm going to spend the most of the talk defending these different parts of wisdom. You might think, to begin with, that that's too much of a philosopher's definition. That's too intellectualized. That there's surely an element of wisdom where the wise person doesn't just know a lot, but the wise person, in fact, lives well. So the wise person, as it were, lives it out. There's an existential component to wisdom, it seems. You don't want to make it purely intellectual. So that's kind of an objection that I'm going to get to later on. But I think I'm going to defend the strong view that the 3 conditions on the handout are not only individually necessary for wisdom, but they're also jointly sufficient. So in fact, when we think of someone as wise, it's because we think they know what's good or important for well-being, where they stand relative to it, and know some effective strategies for bringing about what's good or important. So the distinction, well, let me just skip section 4. We could go back to it in the Q&A. But let me try to say more about then this first condition, that the wise person knows what's good or important for well-being. The way I think, the most appropriate way I think to think about that is that the wise person doesn't simply know what's good or important for well-being, but especially knows how to rank or how to weigh different goods. So the wise person knows what's more or less important for well-being, and especially that the wise person knows, you might say, what's most important for well-being. So I think it would be helpful, I always find it helpful in philosophy to come up with examples. It would help to kind of focus the mind. It would be especially helpful, I think, if I could come before you and say, so here's an example of a obviously wise person that we would all agree is wise, and this is what they thought was good or important for well-being. But that's always going to be a little bit controversial. Even very popular choices like Jesus or Socrates or Gandhi, some people might object in various ways. So maybe the better way, the more illuminating way, would in fact be, I think, to pick out someone who's not wise, someone who's in fact foolish, and see the way in which they fail to meet this condition. But that would, of course, run the risk of being a bit mean, or being, I don't want to denigrate anyone, I don't want to be too nasty. So here's what I propose to do. I think actually, so when I was talking to Dr. Tomko about what you all were reading, it sounded like a nice coincidence. So I think a nice illustration of someone who lacks wisdom would be the character of Ivan Ilyich in Tolstoy's story. Have they read this? They read this, right? The Death of Ivan Ilyich. So if the novella isn't fresh in your mind, it's the story of someone who, Ivan Ilyich, who thought that the most important things in life, throughout most of his life, were to get just the right furniture or clothing or position in society to gain respectability or propriety or to impress his bourgeois friends. And if he wasn't concerned about that, he was concerned about filling up his time with as many pleasant diversions, card games as possible. And while those things were extremely important, the things that were much less important were things like his wife, his kids, very far down on the totem pole of importance. And in fact, the kind of climax of the novel, after he's been screaming in bed for 3 days, in his death throes, he finally comes to realize, so he was in such agony because he was trying to hold on to this idea that his life had been not a waste, that in fact the things that he prized most highly, impressing his friends, getting the right furniture, being proper in the right ways, that he finally gave up on those ideas. And in fact, his young son comes in, if you remember, his wife comes in the room. He feels a kind of compassion and love for them, and suddenly there's a transformation of his life, and he dies shortly thereafter. So what do we want to say about Ivan Ilyich throughout most of his life? I think again, we aren't being mean, it's the fictional character, but he seems almost like a paradigm example of a fool, someone who's not wise. But then what we want to ask ourselves, I think, is why exactly was he not wise? And I would say, in part, because the things that he took to be most important, impressing his friends with his furniture and so on, were in fact much less important than genuinely important things, like his relationship with his wife or his child. Here's another example on the handout. So I mentioned Tywin Lannister, so let's stick with fiction from Game of Thrones. So Tywin Lannister, if you remember from the books or the TV shows, so he's the ruthless patriarch of the Lannister family. And in many ways, actually Tywin Lannister is an interesting figure because he's super cunning, incredibly clever. So we can talk in the Q&A about how someone who's extraordinarily clever is often thought of as wise, often very close to wisdom. But if you think that he's mistaken, so what he seems to prize most dearly is preserving the Lannister line, passing on the Lannister line, making sure the Lannister line continues, and his relationship with his children, the value of innocent life, all that stuff is much less important than the Lannister line. If you think that that's a lack of wisdom, which I think most of us do, I'd submit to you it's because exactly he gets the weighing wrong. He gets the ranking wrong. He prizes certain things too highly and other things not highly enough. And in fact, if we thought that he had reversed that way of ranking things, that perhaps he would grow in wisdom. So those are my two fictional examples. I submit that this idea that the wise person knows what's good or important for well-being, it's also, I think it fits in well with the idea that wisdom is tied to experience. So as you go through more experiences in life, I think when things go well, you gain in wisdom, but the thing is, how exactly is experience tied to wisdom? What exactly do you grow in? My claim would be that what you grow in, if you grow in anything, is a better sense of what's more or less important. So let's say, here's an example that I just referred to on the handout, that at one point in my life, I think losing my job would be the worst thing that could happen to me. But then let's say I lose my job, and lo and behold, I realize that it's not really as bad as I thought. I can kind of struggle through. I can get by. It occurs to me after I lose my job that it would have been much worse if I had lost my friendships or maybe my integrity or something else. Or, there's another example in the handout of the car ride. So maybe I think, I have 3 little kids. Maybe I think that putting them all in the back of the car in one seat and driving like for 12 hours, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Maybe it's not going to be so bad. But 30 minutes in, it becomes this agony of complaining and squabbling. And lo and behold, one of the things that experience reveals is how good or bad certain things are. And indeed, I think it's related to the idea that when someone goes through extreme hardship of any kind, we speak as if the person, it's terrible that they went through this, but we at least think that they gained some wisdom from it. And if we think that's the case, I submit that that's because we really have very little sense prior to the fact about what it would be like to lose a limb, to go blind, to have some catastrophe happen to you. And when that actually happens to you, you have a better sense of, again, how bad this thing is, how bad it really is, and hence how it weighs on the scale of things that are relevant to well-being. So that's a defense of the idea that this idea of knowledge of what's good or important for well-being is essential to wisdom. And you'll notice, I think, that I've been talking a fair bit about well-being now, but I haven't actually told you, nor do I plan to say much about what actually constitutes well-being, because I think that as I've thought more about wisdom, that's actually where the hard part comes in. I think, how I was saying at the beginning, I don't really consider myself wise, but I can talk about wisdom. I think if I were to get up here in front of you guys and say, no, here's what I actually think constitutes well-being, and here's what I think the most important thing is, and here's why, I think that actually is what the wise person would be able to do, to as it were, give a rich kind of filled out substantive theory of wisdom. That, I think, is especially hard, and that, for the purposes of this talk at least, I'm not going to commit one way or the other about a substantive theory of well-being. But I do think, look at the quote now on the second column of your handout. I do think that there's interesting things to say about the kind of well-being that matters. So I'm going to read the quote from Jane Goodall, the renowned conservationist and scientist. She says, "It's awfully sad that with our clever brains capable of taking us to the moon and developing all these sophisticated ways of communicating around the planet, that we seem to have lost wisdom. And that's the wisdom of indigenous people who would make a major decision based on how that decision would affect people 7 generations ahead. We're making decisions now based on the bottom line. How will this affect me and my family now? How will this huge decision affect the next shareholders meeting 3 months ahead? How will this decision I make today affect my election campaign?" Something like that. So although we think we're caring about our children and grandchildren, actually we're stealing their future. So I think there are a lot of interesting things about that Goodall quote, but one thing I think is correct about what she's saying is that, so the kind of well-being I've been talking about, I haven't, for all that I've said so far, the wise person knows what's good or important for his or her own well-being. I actually think our concept of wisdom even just does not allow the wise person simply to be concerned with his or her own well-being. The wise person, I think, almost of necessity, their concern for well-being radiates out. Jane Goodall puts it in terms of the community and also in terms of generations ahead, 7 generations ahead. And I don't know if she's right that it's 7 generations or if it's more than 7, but I do think there's, as it were, an inner logic to the notion of wisdom, that the wise person is concerned not just for his or her own well-being, but for the well-being of the group, the larger community. To use more traditionally Catholic language, say a concern for the common good. I think it is an inherent concern for the person of wisdom. So if someone were just concerned for his or her own well-being at the expense of the community, to the extent that that's even possible, I don't think we would regard that person as wise. So again, it would be hard to say what exactly constitutes the well-being of the community, but I do think this much is true, that it's a kind of concept, the sort of well-being that's larger than just us, that it radiates outward. And this isn't on the handout, but I think, so I'm interested in the theological dimensions of wisdom too. And we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I think one way to make sense of the claim that God alone is wise, the scriptural claim. So even the people that I was saying earlier that you might think of as wise, your grandparents, your cousins, that they wouldn't count as wise, that God alone is wise. One way to understand that claim is that if you're thinking of the sort of relevant well-being as well-being on the greatest scale possible, so the well-being of the universe, the well-being of the whole, then only God, it seemed, would know what's good or important, how to order the well-being of the whole. So if well-being is construed on that scale, the largest possible scale, then only God would count as wise. So we could talk more about that, but I think that fits into this idea too. Now, moving to section 6, knowledge of one's standing relative to these goods. So one thing to ask is, suppose you had knowledge of what's good and important for well-being. I would argue that that's necessary for wisdom. Is it sufficient? And it's a good philosopher's question to ask. And I would say the answer is no, it's not sufficient. So you could illustrate this in all sorts of ways, but just suppose that I think having a strong, respectful marriage is important for my well-being. And let's just stipulate that's true. So it is important for well-being. So I have the first condition met. Maybe I at least understand some things that are important for well-being or for wisdom. But suppose that even though I know this, at the same time my selfish behavior has been eroding my marriage for years, and my wife feels really unhappy, then far from thinking of myself as wise, I begin to seem like something like, again, a fool. Because I realize what's good. I think I actually have this good, but in fact, I'm sorely mistaken. So a more famous example from the history of philosophy that would illustrate this is in Plato's dialogue, The Apology, which focuses on the trial of Socrates. So Socrates talks about how he received this divine sign that he was the wisest person, and he tested out this sign. Have you all read The Apology? Okay. And you remember, so he goes asking people, so seeing if they have knowledge of different things. So he goes to the politicians and say, do you know what justice is? And they give some answer, but it's very unsatisfying. He goes to the generals, and do you know what courage is? And again, they don't really seem to know. So at least he goes through all these people, is very dissatisfied. He hits upon the craftsmen, the shipbuilders and the cobblers, the horse trainers, and he greatly respects the craftsmen because they at least have knowledge of their craft. So the cobblers have knowledge about shoemaking, and the shipbuilders about shipbuilding. But even though he respects them in one way, he thinks something's gone wrong in another, because they get so proud, you might say, because of their knowledge of their shipbuilding or their cobbling, that they also think they have knowledge of very important things, like they have knowledge about the true nature of justice and beauty and goodness. And this is the craftsmen begin to look, again, foolish, because even though they might know something that's genuinely good or important for well-being, having things like knowledge of goodness, knowledge of justice, knowledge of beauty, they mistakenly think they have it already, but they don't. And it's this lack of self-awareness, this lack of understanding about where they stand relative to what's good or important, that is a sign of their lack of wisdom. So, and I think this second condition, knowledge of one's standing relative goods, also makes sense of the injunction, at Delphi on the Temple of Apollo, the famous injunction to know thyself. So I think the wise person, commonsensically, or just we tend to think, has self-knowledge, understands where he or she sits in life. And this idea, I think, of self-knowledge, I think what it's getting at is trying to get a sense of where you stand relative to what's good or important for well-being. So that would be my defense of this second condition. Now, the back of the handout, let's see. So knowledge of strategies. Well, here's the rough thought in this respect. That I feel like I've said the wise person knows what's good or important for well-being. Think of that as kind of point B, the destination. Think of the second condition as they also know where they stand relative to what's good or important. Think of that as point A. I also think that just commonsensically, if someone realized what's good or important for well-being, realized where he or she stood, but had no clue at all about how to get from point A to point B, I think we would think the person would be lacking in wisdom or wouldn't count as wise if they really had no sense of how to make progress towards what's good. And I think we see these strategies, you could think of them in sometimes they're quite specific, sometimes they can be general. I note on the handout that in the Talmud, I heard a rabbi talk about wisdom once, and he said, so in the Jewish tradition, the definition of the wise person is he who learns from all people. So if you think of that claim, the person who's wise is he who learns from all people or she who learns, then that's kind of a meta-level strategy. That's almost a strategy for learning strategies. When you encounter different people in life and you try to learn from them, that's, again, there are these general strategies we adopt to try to be open to experience. And of course, there are a lot of different ways strategies are just encoded in everyday life. So keep calm and carry on, that's a strategy. Don't sweat the small stuff. Develop an attitude of gratitude, etc. I mean, those are all, even just corny things like that, those are strategies for moving from point A to point B to try to attain what you think is good or important for well-being. It could be, whatever it might be, tranquility, peace, things like that. So let me just say, so that's kind of closing section 7 there. I'll just run a little bit of a test case. So I said at the beginning I wasn't going to tell you, I wasn't going to defend certain people as wise or not, but let's at least run through it with one person. So how would Socrates fare according to this scale? Would Socrates end up being wise? I think a good case could be made that Socrates would satisfy these conditions. So Socrates, had knowledge, so he knew, it's kind of talking about knowledge of knowledge, but he thought that what was good or important for well-being was acquiring knowledge, genuine knowledge, of the nature of goodness, of the nature of beauty, of the nature of justice. He knew, so that's the first condition, let's say, he knew where he stood relative to these goods. As you know, famously, Socrates thought that he lacked them. He thought that he was ignorant of these goods. And let's just say he was accurate about that. And he also had a general strategy for trying to realize these goods of knowledge. So for Socrates, it was a process of roughly dialectic. So engaging anyone in debate whom he happened to find. He thought that kind of argument, that kind of reasoning would lead to a greater understanding or bring him closer to a genuine or more satisfying account of the nature of justice or beauty or goodness. So I think Socrates, with just a few plausible assumptions, would count on as wise in this picture, which I take to be a good thing. I think he's a paradigm of wisdom. Now, turn to some complaints. So people who have thought that this account is just wrong-headed. So one of the foremost philosophers who's writing on wisdom now, a philosopher called Sharon Ryan. Sharon Ryan is an epistemologist like I am, who thinks about the nature of these epistemic goods. But what Sharon Ryan thinks is that if you say that you need knowledge to be wise, knowledge of how to live well or these other things, that's just asking too much, that knowledge is not necessary. And Sharon Reason's reason is that if you say, if someone knows things, then virtually all epistemologists would agree that if you know something, that entails that the thing is true. You can't have knowledge of falsehoods, so knowledge requires truth. But Ryan thinks that to require that someone have true beliefs about all these subjects is just too demanding. And it leaves out of account people in history who plausibly had false beliefs about a lot of things, but through no fault of their own. They, as it were very wise or very rational in the way they processed the world, so they should count as wise even though they lack knowledge. So let me read that quote from Ryan, and I think this will give you a sense of what she means by that. So she says, section 8, since so much of what was considered knowledge has been abandoned or has evolved over time, a theory that requires truth through a knowledge condition would exclude almost all people who are now long dead, including Hypatia, Socrates, Aristotle, Homer, Lao Tzu, etc., from the list of the wise. But bad epistemic luck should not count against being wise. So again, her basic thought is, think about these, you might say, just greats of intellectual history, like Confucius or Lao Tzu or Aristotle. In passages that I'm not going to quote here, what Ryan basically reminds us is that their view of the world was, especially when it came to science or how the world worked, was just deeply mistaken. So you might say their sense of how the world hung together or how things, the world worked at a basic level was deeply flawed. But at the same time, we don't want to say that Aristotle wasn't wise or that Socrates wasn't wise or that Confucius wasn't wise. So something less than knowledge would be required. Aristotle or Lao Tzu or Confucius were wise not in virtue of having knowledge or truth, but rather in virtue of having highly rational beliefs. This is kind of a philosopher's objection, now that I think about it. The next one's maybe more compelling. Now, I would say in response to Ryan that this is a very interesting objection, but it doesn't show that, at least the way I've described knowledge, it doesn't touch on, say, deep scientific views about what the world is like. It doesn't touch on anything. So, so long as Aristotle, say, or Confucius or Lao Tzu or Hypatia had accurate beliefs about what was good or important for well-being, about the flourishing of the community, then they would count as wise in virtue of having knowledge in that domain. And the fact that they would miss out on knowledge with respect to, say, the broader scientific picture doesn't bear on wisdom as I've described it here. So there are further interesting things to be said on behalf of Ryan's objection, but for now I'll just leave it at that. And turn to instead the claim that, the question of whether these conditions on knowledge are sufficient. That is, whether someone, in virtue of knowing these three things that I've said, would count as being wise. And there's at least a sense from, this passage from Kierkegaard, which is extraordinary, would suggest that I think there's a way in which, so the general concern is that I've over-intellectualized the idea of wisdom, I've talked too much about knowledge, but surely someone who's wise lives out their knowledge, and I need to capture that. So Kierkegaard's quote suggests a few different ways of thinking about this. So let's read it. He says, to understand and to understand. So I would substitute in there, just for the purposes of this talk, to know and to know. But the way in which understanding comes up might be relevant. To understand and to understand, are these then two different things? Certainly, a person stands there and says the right thing, and so shows that he has stand there and says the right things, and so has understood it. And then when he acts, he does the wrong thing, and so shows that he has not understood it. When one sees someone protesting complete understanding of how Christ went about in the form of a lowly servant, poor, despised, mocked, and as the scriptures say, spitted upon, when I see that same person taking so many pains to seek refuge in the place where in worldliness it is good to be, setting himself up as securely as possible, when I see him so anxiously avoiding as if his life depended on it, every unfavorable breath of wind from right or left, so blissful, so utterly blissful, so jubilant, yes, to round it off, so jubilant that he even emotionally thanks God for it, for being honored and respected by everyone, everywhere, then I have often said to myself, Socrates, Socrates, how could it be possible for this person to have understood what he claims to have understood? So this passage, again, is interesting on a lot of levels. One thing I think it allows, so suppose Kierkegaard is right, that there's, as it were, two kinds of understanding or two kinds of knowledge. That someone could go to church and hear a beautiful homily, walk out the church doors, and say they know what the most important thing is for happiness. Let's just say broadly that it's something like living a Christ-like life. They know that, they can say it, at some level they affirm it, but then as soon as they walk out the doors, the greatest thing they're concerned about is their own status, their own reputation. If push came to shove and some true sacrifice were demanded, if following Christ meant being despised by the world, being spitted upon, being neglected, they wouldn't want any part of that. So I think what Kierkegaard allows us to see is that there's a kind of knowledge, you might say, where you could just have it on a purely intellectual level that certain things are the most important, but fail to live it out. And that kind of knowledge, I would agree that if someone just had knowledge in that, we might call it a disengaged sense or a weak sense. If someone could just affirm what seemed to be true but not live it out, then that person wouldn't seem wise. But we could maybe retrieve or we could repair the definition, the account of wisdom that I offer by suggesting that the kind of knowledge that's necessary for wisdom, the kind of knowledge of what's good or important for well-being, is what we might call an engaged kind of knowledge. So let's say you hear these beautiful things in church about how, or in some other context about the best kind of life. And some days you might, in one life, you just leave it as soon as you go outside the church. But in some other time, it resonates with you. There's, as it were, an uptake by your emotions, by your wills, by your whole orientation in life. It's a kind of knowledge, you might say just trivially, that sinks in. That knowledge that sinks in, that engages your will, that engages your emotions, if you have that kind of knowledge, a real deep-rooted belief, then I think that's not an over-intellectualized version of knowledge, is it? That's a knowledge that has deep practical relevance. So if Kierkegaard is right, we could say this, that really there are two kinds of knowledge. There's disengaged knowledge, when you just say something but don't act it out, and there's engaged knowledge, and what's necessary for wisdom is engaged knowledge. We could say that, but sometimes, actually, I think I'm tempted to say something stronger. That perhaps the person who has disengaged knowledge, who says these things and then goes out and lives a life that's completely different, perhaps that person doesn't have knowledge at all, even in a weak, kind of disengaged sense. Because you might think, most epistemologists think who work on this, is that to know something, you actually have to really believe it. Belief is a necessary ingredient in knowledge. And arguably, if you think that living a Christ-life way is the best life, but that doesn't manifest itself in any of your actions, then arguably you're, as it were, just parroting these claims, but you don't actually believe it. So it's not, if on that way of thinking about it, it's not like there's weak knowledge and strong knowledge, disengaged knowledge and engaged knowledge. All knowledge, you might say, has to be engaged because it has a belief component that has to in some way guide your life. Now, there's a quote, again, that I think is a nice way to get at this, from a contemporary philosopher called Eric Schwitzgebel, who's just commenting on belief, where he says, the aim of attributing belief is to say something about how we steer through if the aim of attributing belief is to say something about how we steer through the world, then judgment cannot be sufficient for belief. So what is Schwitzgebel's claiming there? He's claiming that if all you're going to do is say things and not live them out, then that you might judge them on some level, but you don't believe it on a deeper level. And if he's right about that, then again, the disengaged knowledge wouldn't count even as knowledge at all because it would lack the belief component. So I think we're turning towards home. How much time do we have, Michael? Close? Okay, so let me just give a few thoughts about some difficulties of becoming wise. So if wisdom, in fact, requires not just knowledge in some intellectualized sense, but engaged knowledge, knowledge that engages your volition, that engages your emotions, that engages your will, that it's in fact very hard to become wise, especially if wisdom requires anything demanding kind of sacrifice in the way you live your life. And of course, another difficulty of becoming wise would be figuring out. So you might have some general sense of what's more or less important for well-being, but actually, in a particular situation, what's more or less important for well-being, that will be very hard to discriminate. But thinking about, in line with Kierkegaard, thinking about Christian approaches to wisdom in particular, I think it's telling that when Aquinas talks about wisdom, he talks about wisdom primarily, he talks about wisdom briefly when he's going through Aristotle's different list of the virtues and the intellectual virtues. Wisdom as an intellectual virtue shows up in a few articles, but his primary discussion of wisdom is when he's talking about what he calls the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So Aquinas has this discussion of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the fruits of the Holy Spirit. My understanding is that when people still had to learn the Baltimore Catechism, they all knew the gifts of the Holy. There's 7 gifts, 12 fruits. I'm kind of post-Baltimore Catechism too, so I don't know them either. But I do know wisdom was supposed to be a gift. And I think the thought is that from a Christian perspective at least, to be wise, to have this engaged knowledge of how best to live your life is just not the kind of thing that you would think up in a philosophy classroom sometime. If to really live a good life is a life where you're despised by the world, where you risk it, or where you're shunned by the world, that's not the kind of thing that's commonsensical at all. And to really have this idea take root in your soul arguably requires something more than just natural reflection, perhaps something supernatural. I think that's what Aquinas was stressing in his account of wisdom. So it's hard to become wise. The last thing I just want to say, one final virtue of the account, is that so I've been talking about wisdom. So Tim noted that wisdom is not much discussed by philosophers these days. And I think one of the reasons is that when you talk about people who are wise, if it has this connotation of knows what's good or important for well-being and what's more or less important for well-being, that suggests a kind of rich, you might say, objectivity or objectivism about there actually being things that are more or less important for well-being. And in eras where that idea goes out of fashion, where you might think that what's more or less important for well-being is just a matter of preference or cultural conditioning, then I think the notion of wisdom would in fact go out of favor too. So it in fact depends upon, I think, some rich ethical or metaphysical commitments that when they fall out of fashion, the notion of wisdom too falls out of fashion. And I think that my account, I hope it does capture that phenomenon too. So thank you very much.